Hi, we are going to be talking about muscle physiology. Remember that for the muscle anatomy, that's going to be your lab component. So make sure that you are reviewing module 6 of your book. Okay, so within your lab book, you had module 6 to do. And I know that it's going to tell you to take a look at the models, and we don't have the models here, but you do have the images of the models in your atlas and most of the images of the other models that we have as well there. You also have images of the histological slides, so of all those microscope slides, so make sure that you're looking at that as well. Your lab component that you're going to have in your part of answering the lab part, remember that you are going to have mastering questions to do there, and so that's going to be targeting what you learn in lab, so make sure that you're going over all of those pieces as well. As for the muscle physiology, I really want to go over this in a little bit more detail here during this lecture. So let's start with what are muscles. So if you remember from your 4 different types of tissue, we have our connective tissue, our epithelial tissue, our nervous tissue, and our muscle tissue. So here we're looking at that muscle tissue. And if you remember, there are 3 types of muscle tissue that we're going to be looking at. The first type of that muscle tissue is going to be your smooth muscle, and that is the one that is involuntary, can be found in most of the organs of your body, and is uninucleated. And it's going to be smooth, so you're not going to see any striations in that one. The other 2 are going to be your skeletal and cardiac. They're both going to be striated, which means that they look like they have those lines that are going down it and intersecting it. And they're going to be a little bit different in their type of nuclei. So cardiac muscle is going to be uninucleated, and it's going to have something called intercalated disc. And remember that that one will only be found in the heart. So smooth muscle is found in your organs, all those visceral organs, stomach, blood vessels, kidney, liver, etc. And then your cardiac muscle is going to be found solely in your heart. Both of them are going to be involuntary, and they're both going to be uninucleated. We are not going to talk about those now during this chapter of muscle physiology. Just wanted to give you a quick recap on that. What we're going to focus on from this point on is only going to be on the skeletal muscle. And the skeletal muscle matters a lot because this is going to be the portion that we're going to be talking about with regards to the function of thermal regulation and with regards to how your muscles contract and relax in ways that are involved with the neuromuscular junction, right? And your skeletal muscle, remember, is going to be the only one that is voluntary, so you can choose to move it, though sometimes you also have your autonomic nervous system come in to place to actually take care of moving it. So if you think of your diaphragm, for instance, your diaphragm is one of the muscles that controls your breathing. But you can choose to breathe in and out. Right now, you can go and move your diaphragm. Therefore, it's voluntary. So your diaphragm is actually made out of skeletal muscle, but your autonomic nervous system comes into play, helping you control that skeletal muscle so that you don't have to think about it constantly. All right, so what things to keep in mind about your skeletal muscle? First of all, is that along with the skeleton, it's going to act as a system of levers and pulleys to move the body with great force or very precisely. So your bones and your skeletal muscles are going to be highly tied together to control movement of your body, also to help maintain posture and to help maintain the force and exertion your body can keep. Okay. And skeletal muscle will also be required for the physical movement of your body per se. All right, so some of the functions of skeletal muscle, and again, these are the functions of skeletal muscle, not smooth and cardiac. Smooth we'll look at a little bit more detail when we get into the digestive system, for instance, in 169. And we're going to look in more detail at the cardiac muscle, also when we get into 169, specifically looking at blood vessels, and how the heart works. All right, so some of the functions of the skeletal muscle are going to include that they produce movement. They help maintain your posture and your body position. They stabilize joints, and they're going to help maintain temperature. So remember that your integumentary system was highly important in thermal regulation. This is another high component of thermal regulation because it's going to help you produce heat. So one of the things that happen is when your core body temperature gets a little bit down, your extremities will start to shiver, and they start to shiver to produce more heat so that that heat can be transferred to those important visceral organs. Okay, some of the characteristics of skeletal muscle are going to be things like excitability, contractility, extensibility, and elasticity. And those may sound like very confusing words, but they're actually very simple. So if you think about excitability, if you're easily excited, it's that you can easily respond to a stimulus. And this is important because you want your muscles to react quickly. If I put my hand down on a hot stove, I don't want my muscle to take long to actually move my hands away from the hot stove. I want my biceps brachii to function quickly and move that hand away so that I don't get badly burnt. So you want your muscles to respond quickly to a stimulus so that the nervous system will give it that appropriate response. So if you remember when we're talking about how your nerve receptors in your integumentary system, you have those touch receptors we talked about, for instance, your Pacinian corpuscle and your Meissner's corpuscle. And we talked about how those are going to receive messages. So if you think about those are going to receive some messages, and temperature and feelings of extreme heat can run through there. And they're going to arrive by your central nervous system, which is then going to tell your biceps brachii, basically, you need to move that hand away from it. And you want your biceps brachii to respond perfectly to that nervous system. Contractile. So muscle, and we're going to look at this in detail, has the ability to shorten. And just like it has the ability to shorten, it's also going to have the ability to stretch out. And this is important because if you think about that biceps brachii, it needs to shorten so that it can bring that radius and ulna up towards your shoulder. But then it needs to be able to stretch back down to release that tension as well. And then it's also going to have elasticity, which means that it can return to normal. So you can stretch as far as you need or up to a certain amount. You can shorten that muscle. It responds quickly to stimulus, and it can return to normal. All right, so let's look at the structure of muscles per se, because this is going to be extremely important. So muscle cells are going to be known specifically as muscle fibers, and this can get a little confusing because when you think about a fiber, you usually think about a long piece of some type of like strand, or you might think of like the fibers that connect the internet to your house, for instance. They're going to be these very long, thin fibers. And so it might be a little confusing to you to think about a cell as a fiber. But when you think about what a muscle cell actually looks like, it is a fiber. It is a long tube-like cell that contains all the basic components that a cell contains, but instead it's going to be elongated instead of being a round or square cell. So we have very long tube-like cells. And the key features of these tube-like cells is that they are going to be highly protected by connective tissue wrappings. And there's going to be 3 types connective tissue wrappings that all muscles are going to contain. They have something called an epimysium, and this is going to cover your entire muscle. So this is what your muscle looks like. So you can see here that you have the muscle cell with its epimysium, the entire muscle with its epimysium covering it. And the entire muscle is full of what are called small bundles, and each one of those bundles are what are called fascicles. And you can see that there. Those fascicles are going to be very important as well. So when we're looking at it, we have the entire muscle around here. Okay, sorry about that. And then you're going to have those muscle fibers, those muscle bundles, that are going to come out here called your fascicles. And each one of these fascicles is going to be composed of many muscle fibers, which are these guys located right here. right? And then each one of these is going to be composed of or protected by a different connective tissue wrapping. So your muscle fiber, which is the innermost, is going to have what is called endomysium around it, endo for inner. Your fascicle is going to be covered by what is called perimysium. And then your most external one, which is going to be the entire muscle, will be covered by epimysium. So essentially, a muscle is a large tube made of smaller tubes called fascicles, made of even smaller tubes called muscle cells, which, if you remember, a muscle cell is a muscle fiber. All right. Other things that you will notice are going to be that it's also going to contain blood vessels and nerve fibers. And this is going to be really important because if you think about what a muscle does, it needs to contract and relax a lot. So it's going to involve a lot of energy. And why would you need lots of blood vessels if you need energy? I'm going to leave that question for you to think of. And I'm going to bring it up again when we have our collaborate session for you to answer. Also, I want you to think about why you would have a lot of nerve fibers in your muscle. So answer that question and write it down somewhere. And then I'm going to have a little Q&A session with you during the collaborate session. And I'm going to ask you that one again. Why would your muscle cells have so many blood vessels and nerve fibers? All right. Muscles are going to be attached to your body by two important things. Those are going to be called your tendons and your aponeurosis. And your tendon is essentially a long piece of connective tissue that connects that muscle to the bone, right? All muscles will be connected to bone on two sides. One is going to be to the bone that is known as the immovable bone or stationary bone. It's a bone that's pretty much stays still, while the other bone is the one that moves towards the stationary bone. So if you think again about your arm and you touching that hot stove, you will end up exerting pressure, right? So you're going to contract that biceps brachii, bringing your hands up towards your shoulder. Okay, so you are essentially going to bring that radius and that ulna up towards the shoulder. So the insertion would be the attachment to the movable bone, so the parts of the bicep brachii that are attaching to the radius. And then the origin would be the part that is attaching to the shoulder. Okay. We're going to continue talking here about what is called a motor unit, and then we're going to get into specific details about the muscle physiology. The muscle physiology, additional details that we're going to talk about, like what actually happens for a nerve to cause muscles to move. We're going to look at that in the next video. So I'm going to have two videos for you so that they're not too lengthy. This is just the first of those two videos. All right, so a motor unit is what you call the motor neuron plus the muscle cell interaction. And so basically what that means is that you have a nerve cell that is going to be transmitting a signal to your muscle cell, okay? And so there has to be a point at which those two connect. And you're going to see in a little bit how they don't actually touch each other. They get very close to touching each other, okay? And so they're going to have a little bit of a gap between them, but each muscle cell will be innervated by one motor neuron. And so that interaction between that motor neuron, so that nerve cell that's talking to the muscle, that's what's going to be called your motor unit. And this gives what is called a cell-cell communication core principle. And basically what this tells you is that for every single one motor neuron, you're going to have all the muscle cells that one single motor neuron could innervate. So each muscle cell will be innervated by only one nerve cell. But a nerve cell has many endings of axons so that it can attach to several muscle fibers. Okay. Small motor units are going to have only a few muscle cells, while large motor units will have many muscle cells. So the large motor units are going to be in charge of things like strength, but not fine movement, while small motor units are going to be in charge of fine movement, but not strength. So think about examples of large motor units in your body and think about examples of small motor units in your body. For instance, your bicep brachii needs to move your entire arm. And if you could think about having to pick up something from the floor and bring it up. Or for your mothers out there, pick up that baby or that toddler from the floor screaming at you and bring it up to your body. You're going to need to put a lot of force on that bicep brachii sometimes. So therefore, that's going to be an example of a large motor unit. It's for strength, not fine movements. However, if you were to put up your index finger right now and start to move that little finger around, waggle that finger, that's going to involve fine movements, not strength. You really can't pick up anything too heavy with that finger, but it can do a little bit of fine movements that your bicep brachii can't do. So that's going to be an example of small motor units. Okay, and this image shows you what it looks like. So you have basically what you have up there on your right of that image is showing you a cross cut of the spinal cord, or what is known as the transverse cut of the spinal cord. And you can see there that you have a nerve exiting the spinal cord and heading towards the biceps brachii. The biceps brachii is shown on your left, top left, but then it's also showing an arrow down to what it looks like. So if you remember, each muscle is going to be a bundle of many fascicles, and each fascicle is going to contain many muscle fibers or muscle cells. So that image down there that is all blue and purple and orange or peach or whatever color this whole area here that I'm outlining, this is one fascicle with many individual many individual muscle cells or muscle fibers. And each of these muscle fibers is going to be innervated by only one nerve ending. You can see one nerve ending here, one nerve ending here, one nerve ending here, etc., etc. And remember, sorry, to go back a second, remember that interaction between the two is what is called your motor unit. And so you have many motor units in one single muscle cell. All right, now let's look a little bit more detail about the anatomy here of the muscle. So we looked at the muscle in general. It's a big tube composed of fascicles and covered by its epimysium. Each individual fascicle covered by its perimysium. Within the fascicle, many muscle cells or muscle fibers covered by their endomysium. Now let's look at one of those individual muscle fibers or cells in more detail. So that single muscle cell is going to be covered, of course, since it's a cell. And if you remember the parts of the cell that we discussed at the beginning of this semester, you remember that all cells are going to be covered by what is called a plasma membrane or a cell membrane, which is what determines what can come in and out of the cell, and it helps protect the cell. So in muscle cells, the plasma membrane is going to be extremely important, and therefore it's going to get its own name. Plus, in medicine, they like to give 20 different names to everything, so here's a new name to learn. The plasma membrane in muscles will be called your sarcolemma. One of the ways to remember this is sarco will always refer to muscles. So whenever you see the word sarco, it refers to muscles. And the lemma refers to the plasma membrane. So your sarcolemma is your plasma membrane on your muscle cell. And you can see here, your entire cell, instead of being round like your classic cells that we learned about at the beginning of the semester, it's going to be a cell just like that, but it's like if you took that cell and you elongated it. And this is what it looks like. It's very elongated. It's a tube. And that sarcolemma is a plasma membrane covering it. Now, the plasma membrane in muscle cells does something interesting in that it actually penetrates into the cell quite a bit. So instead of just lying on covering the outside of the cell, it actually penetrates inside the cell, forming what is called T-tubules. And you can see those here, these T-tubules here, that are the parts of the sarcolemma that are actually penetrating into that muscle fiber or muscle cell. Okay. And those T-tubules will actually penetrate into the muscle cell and lie up against what is called our endoplasmic reticulum, or in the case of muscle cells, sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this whole blue structure that you're seeing down here, all of this blue here, is your large endoplasmic reticulum. Okay. And one of the things we're going to be looking at when we talk in more detail about the physiology of muscles is that muscles need to produce a lot of proteins. So there's going to be a lot of proteins involved, actin, myosin, and many others that we're going to talk about. And because it needs to produce so many proteins, if you remember, endoplasmic reticulums, one of the things they produce is proteins. So therefore, you're going to have an extensive endoplasmic reticulum in muscles. Hence, it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you can see how it covers the inner part of that muscle cell. Okay. And then the other thing that you're going to see here is the myofibrils. So these red and purple lines that you're seeing under here are what are called myofibrils, and we're going to look at it in the next slide in a little bit more detail. And these myofibrils are actually what each muscle cell is individually going to contain that are going to help it do its contracting and relaxing portion. Just a quick note, the cytoplasm of muscle cells is what is called sarcoplasm. The other two things that a muscle cell is going to contain a lot of is going to be multiple nuclei and abundant mitochondria. And so you can think about why a skeletal muscle will have a lot of nuclei, and you can think about why they're going to have a lot of mitochondria. And that's part of what we'll talk about when we have our little collaborate session. So think about those two things. And this is actually the structure of the muscle fiber cells, the last thing I'm going to talk about here in this lecture. And then we're going to continue with the next lecture for discussing the rest of the physiology. Okay, so a muscle fiber cell is going to have hundreds of myofibrils. So hundreds of those pink and blue lines that you saw back here, or reddish, whatever color that is, blue lines that you saw running through the muscle cell. So it's actually going to contain hundreds of those. And if you think that a muscle contains thousands of muscle cells, you can just multiply in your head how many myofibrils you will actually find within just one muscle. Okay, and so these myofibrils will be mostly a collection of thick and thin filaments. So there are some filaments, as you can see down here, that are going to be thick, which are these here that are these big yellow ones. And then you're going to have some thin filaments, which are these that are located over here. And so the thin filaments are going to be mostly made out of something called actin, and the thick filaments are going to be made out of something called myosin. Okay. And these are going to be arranged in a unit like this. So you're going to have many of these repeating throughout the muscle cell, but basically it's going to be thin filaments, thick filament, thin filament, one sarcomere, another thin filament, thick filament, thin filament, another sarcomere, and so on and so forth until you get the ends of the muscle cell. So there are many of these repeating patterns, so many sarcomeres in just one muscle cell. Okay. The thin filaments are also what is called light bands, because when you look at this under a microscope, it actually looks like there's a light area, and the thick bands are the myosin bands, or those thick filaments, because they actually look dark under the microscope. So you can see this here. If you remember from the beginning of the semester when you did histology, or I should say this last exam when we looked at histology, you may have remembered that this is what skeletal muscle looks like. And you can see here that skeletal muscle has these long striations all along here. These striations are actually made by the dark filaments. So each one of these long black lines that you see is the myosin filament, and each one of these light colors, so the light color in between the thick, are the actin. So it's thick filament, thin filament, thick filament, thin filament, thick filament, thin filament, repeating over and over again. So one muscle cell is actually, and you can see this here from here to here, and going across is one muscle cell, and you can see how many thick and thin filaments it has, how many repeating sarcomeres you're going to contain in that one area. All right, I'm going to leave it here for this lecture. Please make sure that you're reviewing this lecture very well before we meet and taking notes before we have our collaborate session, so that you can bring any questions that you have there. I hope you have a good night. Bye.